You're dying of thirst in 1349. The well is right there. But the town whispers, it's poisoned, not by rot, by them. Torches flare, doors splinter, accounts vanish in the flames. Here's the twist. This wasn't random hysteria. Councils met. Confessions were tortured into existence. Debts were wiped clean the morning after. In Basel, a wooden house was built on an island, so an entire community could be burned inside it. In Strasbourg, 2,000 people died on St. Valentine's Day, and creditors celebrated. We're about to trace how fear, theology, and money fused into mass murder. Imagine panic with paperwork. Ready? Let's dive. It didn't start with bodies. It started with a story. In October 1348, on Lake Geneva, a Jew named Agumet was tortured in the castle of Châtel and confessed to scattering poison in wells from Venice to Toulouse. His words, bled out of him, were copied and mailed like chain letters to towns along the Rhine. The packet didn't just carry a tale, it carried instructions. Here is your culprit. Here is your method. Here is your permission. Civic leaders, terrified, harried, strapped for cash, saw in those pages the perfect solvent for fear and for debt. Imagine a rumor getting a city seal. That's how it spread. A manufactured confession became the map of a massacre. A myth put on municipal letterhead. And the plague kept coming anyway. The wells were never the problem. But the story. The story was gasoline. Picture a cold hall in Benfeld, Alsace. Lords, bishops, and city deputies gathered like surgeons about to amputate. The question on the table is obscene in its simplicity. What shall be done with the Jews? Strasbourg's delegates say they know no evil of their community. That should have been the end. Instead, pressure hardens into policy. The Bishop of Strasbourg and the imperial cities agree. Do away with them. It reads like an order handed down a chain of command, because it was. That meeting wasn't medicine. It was triage with scapegoats. And when the decision left the room, it walked on boots. Within days, arrests spread. Wells were sealed. Not to protect lives, but to prepare a stage. It's easy to imagine panic as a mob. Harder to face it as a committee. But this is what the record shows. Fear got a calendar, a quorum, and a plan. In Basel, citizens marched into City Hall and forced the council to swear an oath, burn the Jews, and forbid their return for 2 centuries. That's not the heat of a riot. That's policy under duress. Then came logistics. A wooden structure was erected on a Rhine island. The community was driven inside and burned. Children were reportedly pulled out, not to be saved, but to be baptized and sent away. Basel didn't just murder, it tried to erase, and it promised itself a future without those it had killed. No Jew in the city for 200 years. This is the politics of panic, ritualized, notarized, and lethal. If you think that sounds medieval, ask yourself what it looks like when policy still targets a minority today, just with cleaner fonts and better public relations. Different century, same calculus. 5 days after a guild's revolt toppled the patrician leadership, the new regime marched Strasbourg's Jews to the cemetery. A wooden platform waited. Those who agreed to baptism were spared. The rest, around 2,000, were burned. Here's the real twist. After the ashes cooled, the council canceled all debts owed to Jews and ordered their pledges and notes surrendered. Cash on hand was divided among the working men. Chronicler Jakob von Königshofen says the quiet part loud. The money was indeed the thing that killed the Jews. This wasn't only fear of disease, It was fiscal cleansing dressed as plague control. If you've ever wondered how moral panics turn into profit, look here. Swap a pathogen for a scapegoat, then zero out the ledger. Medieval? Sure. Modern? Look at any crisis where the solution magically benefits those who shout the loudest. The city even timed it. A public bonfire on a saint's day, for a story that would retell itself. By August 1349, terror was metastatic. In Mainz, one of Europe's great Jewish centers, violence exploded. In Cologne, on the night of August 23rd, 24th, mobs stormed the Jewish quarter, killing and burning while city leaders watched paralysis turn to convenience. Why those dates? Because panic had a season. As plague crested, so did the urge to purge. Chroniclers and museums alike remember the day as scapegoating, a neat word for thousands dead and a metropolis stripped of a community that had financed, healed, and traded there for generations. And just as in Strasbourg, those with the deepest debts and the strongest grudges discovered that outrage could be monetized. Imagine that moment. Flames reflected in the Rhine, a city's conscience reflected in the accounts it wouldn't have to pay. Erfurt's massacre unfolded in March 1349. As crowds converged, some Jews set fire to their own homes and died within the flames rather than be torn apart outside them. This was not an isolated riot. It sat in a chain. Toulon and Barcelona to the south, Basel and Strasbourg on the Rhine, Erfurt in Thuringia, Frankfurt beyond. The dead left behind more than homes. Looting delivered manuscripts to city hands, Hebrew treasures, including a 12th century Tosefta, which ended up in a church library centuries later. The pogrom didn't just erase lives, it laundered culture into trophies. The plague would strike Erfurt anyway, killing thousands weeks later. So much for the cure. When fear chooses a target, evidence becomes an inconvenience. Bones and books both tell the truth of what followed. Frankfurt's story reads like a boardroom memo written in blood. After the king transferred his claims over Jewish taxes to the city, patricians and guilds allegedly saw a shortcut: erase the creditors along with the debts. Later memory and local research frame the pogrom as a carefully plotted massacre involving the king's interests, noble houses, and the council. Protection promises evaporated when profit beckoned. It's tempting to imagine the Middle Ages as chaos. Don't. This was coordination. The target was predictable. The reward, quantifiable. City fathers who preached order and Christian virtue discovered that nothing cleans books like a bonfire. If you've ever sat in a meeting where someone says, "We can't afford the fallout," remember that in 1349, fallout meant human beings. The result wasn't just deaths. It was a reset of who owned streets, shops, and futures. From the papal court at Avignon, Clement VI watched Europe convulse and did something braver than you think. He said the story was a lie. On July 6, 1348, he reissued Sicut Judaeus, reaffirming protection for Jews. On September 26, he went further, condemning the accusations and scolding clergy to defend the innocent, adding that greed, not godliness, stood behind many attacks. Avignon and the Papal States followed his lead. There, the burnings stopped. But north of the Alps, fear had become policy. His parchment couldn't smother civic oaths and guild revolts. In October 1349, Clement issued another bull, this time against the flagellants, whose processions had inflamed crowds and sharpened anti-Semitic frenzy. He ordered their suppression. It tells you everything that one of the most powerful men in Christendom could barely dent the tidal surge. Panic had found better patrons: debt, ambition, and the thrill of righteous violence. Imagine 1,000 men stripped to the waist, backs opened by whips, chanting through market squares. They promised purification by pain and pointed at poisoners as the reason God was angry. The spectacle sold certainty in a world rotting from uncertainty. University theologians balked, kings worried, Clement VI condemned them. But while it lasted, the movement amplified everything toxic. What's a confession worth when it's signed under a lash and sung by a chorus of blood? The flagellants offered towns an easy script: sin, blame, purge, repeat. Processions became press releases, and when the beatings stopped, the damage remained. Neighbors turned accusers, mercy turned to ash. Today we have viral videos and hashtags. In 1349 they had drums, hymns, and an audience primed by terror. Different tools, same human wiring. Look back at Strasbourg's ledger. Debts cancelled, cash distributed, pledges seized. Then scan other towns where property changed hands at the speed of fire. Historians have a cold phrase for it: political economy. Samuel Cohn argues the 1348-51 wave was not simple mob madness, but in many places a top-down choice by power holders who stood to gain: patricians, guilds, rural lords, even emperors. In Frankfurt, sources say the council moved after royal claims shifted. In Cologne, the council sat on its hands while the quarter burned. In Basel, the council swore an oath. Everywhere, panic didn't just kill, it paid dividends. Panics always do for somebody. When leaders discover that fear can double as a financial instrument, morality becomes a luxury good. The plague was biological. The massacres were political. Don't confuse the two. The Châtel-Chillon Confession of Agumet wasn't just spectacle. It became stationary. Copies traveled from Savoy to Switzerland to the Rhineland, a template for interrogations elsewhere. We found poison in wells, one report boasted, because after you torture a man to say poison, you can find anything. The mechanism is chillingly familiar. Extract a narrative under pain, transmit it with seals, repeat until doubt looks like treason. In a world without microscopes, a scrap of parchment could outweigh the stench of real disease. And once other towns began to burn, each fire justified the next. We burned ours because they burned theirs. Panic became a provincial contagion, carried not by fleas, but by clerks. By 1350, entire Jewish networks along the Rhine were gone. Cities emptied by fire, exile, or baptism under duress. Survivors followed rumors of refuge to places like the Jagiellonian realms, Poland, and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, where rulers, for a time, competed for their skills. It was not safety as we'd understand it. It was a bargain, protection in exchange for taxes and services. But against the ashes of Strasbourg or the charred island at Basel, it looked like life. This is the final cruelty of 1348-49. Communities didn't just die. They were displaced so thoroughly that later generations had to dig to remember they had ever lived there at all. Chroniclers claimed they found powders. Councils claimed salvation. Flagellants claimed God demanded blood. The plague did not care. It raged before, during, and after the burnings. Erfurt burned, and then the pest took 16,000. Strasbourg burned, and the pest kept coming. Clement VI called it what it was, a pestilence permitted by God, not a human plot. He protected Jews in Avignon, and there the killings stopped. Everywhere else, the poison proved ideological, fear weaponized by power into policy. Here's the modern echo. When disaster hits, someone will always point at a minority and say, "There, that's the reason." And someone else will check their balance sheet. The Black Death's well-poisoning panic is forgotten not because it's irrelevant, but because it's uncomfortably familiar. Imagine this. You're at the well again. You dip the bucket. You hear a whisper, "Don't drink." And then you hear another, louder voice. "It's their fault." In 1349, the second voice won. And it won because it had paperwork, pulpits, and profit on its side. We began with a myth-busting truth. The plague was real, the poison was not. From Savoy's tortured confession to Benfeld's cold decision, from Basel's oath to Strasbourg's Valentine's inferno, Europe choreographed a continent-wide blame ritual. Councils swore, guilds marched, bishops nodded, and when it was over, debts were gone and neighborhoods were empty. The bodies were not just victims of disease. They were victims of a story, one that laundered terror into policy and policy into loot. Here's the hardest part to swallow. A pope tried to stop it. Clement VI reissued protections, condemned the lies, even struck at the flagellant's theater of pain. In Avignon, it worked. Elsewhere, it failed. Why? Because the disease was only half the crisis. The other half was a moral collapse that let leaders discover they could buy order with someone else's life. They didn't need proof. They needed a pretext. Fear supplied it. Economics sealed it. Theology sanctified it. And the drums did the rest. Look again at the receipts. Strasbourg didn't just kill. It balanced its books in the blaze. Basel didn't just burn. It declared a 200-year erasure. Mainz and Cologne weren't accidents. They were late summer harvests of rage. Erfurt's self-immolations weren't panic. They were a final, blazing no. This is the story we'd rather skip because it shows how quickly civilized cities can become accountants of atrocity. People we'd call respectable drew up lists, stamped orders, and went home believing they had saved the town. They didn't. The plague kept killing because microbes don't read minutes. So what's the takeaway? First, beware the meeting where fear gets an agenda. When a rumor shows up with a seal, ask who profits. Second, trust the math that matters. If the solution doesn't stop the crisis but somehow enriches its loudest advocates, you're not watching public health. You're watching public theater. Third, learn to hear the quieter voice, the one that says, "We know no evil of them." Strasbourg's deputies said it, and were drowned out. We can choose not to repeat that mistake. Here's the real twist that binds 1349 to now. We don't need wells to repeat this. We have networks that can carry a digital Agimet's confession to millions in minutes. We have our own flagellants, performers of punishment, marching online, beating the drum of blame and demanding a cleansing. We have leaders who can rediscover how profitable panic can be. The forms change. The human wiring hasn't. And yet, the record gives us another option. It shows that even in the worst months, some officials resisted. Some towns refused to burn. Some scribes wrote what really happened so that centuries later we could read it and wince and maybe choose better. A chronicler in Strasbourg wrote that money was the thing that killed the Jews. That line is a mirror. It asks us what our currency of cruelty is now. Clicks, votes, contracts, applause, and whether we are willing to pay it. So, one haunting question to leave you with. When fear comes knocking in our century, which voice will we amplify, the one that says burn, or the one that says, we know no evil? Think about that the next time you scroll past a rumor with a target in it. If this shook you, subscribe for more dark history ripped from real documents, not myths. Drop a comment. Which moment stunned you most? The oath in Basel, the ledger in Strasbourg, or the Pope shouting into the storm? And if you're glad this isn't 1349, hit like. Let's tell the past honestly, so we don't rehearse it.